everybody, welcome to my talk. It's called A Tryst with Destiny, a retrospective from 2012. So let's get on with the general pleasantries. My name is Tejas. I'm a game designer. Currently, I'm working at Double 11, the icon on the far left. But way back in the day, about 11 years ago, I started my career with Blue Giant Interactive. So we're here to talk about one of the games Blue Giant Interactive made. It's a game called Tryst. It was a sci-fi RTS, and it bombed terribly. It had an average Metacritic score of 50. It did not have the most glowing of reviews. And yeah, that's what the game was. The game itself was an RTS. We launched with a campaign and a multiplayer element. And the USPs for the game were that we had two unique asynchronous races, and we had this very crazy upgrade system that did things differently from what RTSs were doing at the time. So I know Vijay's talked about us already, but the company that made it was Blue Giant Interactive. At any given point of time, we were about 20 to 30 people, if memory serves correct. And we were based right out of Hyderabad, technically right down the road. They're very close to the Madhapur petrol pump in a place called Raghunath Towers, 3rd floor. Yeah, so before we begin, let's look back to a little bit of a history and talk about Apox. Apox was the company's first game. They had formed sometime around 2008, 2009, and spent 2-ish years working on this game. It was a wastelandish inspired RTS with a lot of crazy mechanics, and I mean a lot of mechanics that they just added in. It was almost feature creep. But it was ambitious, and they put it out there. And it launched with an only multiplayer release in January 2011. That did kind of hit them a little bit because people at the time expected single-player campaigns with their RTSs, or any game, really. Only multiplayer releases are a thing of the last few years, but back in 2011, not really the case. So the team scrambled, and they put a campaign together and released it in May 2011. This was my introduction to the company, where I got to QA the campaign a little bit. But the fun thing is that Tryst released in September 2012. And if you do the math and account for a few months after the launch of the second or the campaign and supporting that, you get an idea of the timeline we were working with on this. So let's get to the actual retrospective part of this talk. I'm going to take a slightly different format. I'm going to be talking about the realities we faced, the consequences of those, and the decisions we took as a result. And because of that, that led to new realities we faced. And it's kind of what game dev is like. You have just one domino, one decision you take at some point, and it just leads to a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's get started. Our first reality was the reception to Apox. It was worse than Tryst. It had a lower Metacritic score. People kind of had nothing really great to say. There was like I had said earlier, there was a lot of mechanics, but that meant there was a lot of micromanagement. So people, like, that hit the company, it hit morale a bit. And when you've created an indie studio way back in the day, the founders had put in their own money. It was self-funded. There was no investment. That meant there were certain fiscal obligations that were starting to kind of make themselves known. The team had taken a big confidence hit. They had spent 2-ish to 3 years working on this, and to get a reception like that never feels good. And that also meant that we had less time left to either continue with this game or to do something new. As a consequence of that, and the decision had to be made that we have a shortened dev time. We could have made a decision to just call it quits at that point, but the company didn't. They also, thanks to all the reviews, realized where they had shortcomings in their team. Namely, they didn't have a designer. They had a lot of reviews that talked about the bland art style, so they're like, we should get an art director. They didn't have QA with the initial game, so they got a bunch of QA coming in as well. So they hired a few key positions to kind of fill these gaps in the hopes that that'll fix some of the problems. But then we also had this problem. It was something that we were all always acutely aware of, more so management than the team, but the team was, I mean, you can't be unaware in a small team like this. So that kind of also affects you a little bit. It did affect us towards the end of game dev, where we did have a few months where people couldn't be paid because we were just running out of money. We had to keep the lights on, so we did that. But to the team's credit, we all stuck it out to launch and just to see the game through and see how it went. But of course, that also hits your confidence in each other a little bit, in kind of the company, in our ability to stay open as well. To that end, we decided to go for a Hail Mary. So instead of supporting APOX, we're like, we go big or we go home. So we decided to make one more RTS. We take everything we've learned. We've got new people coming in to kind of inject a little bit of new thought processes into things. And the attrition between the two games wasn't super high either, so that was good. But this was still a big thing. The fact that a lot of the team, the older team, had lost confidence in a lot of things. So it ended up in a lot of little things over time, just constantly second-guessing decisions. You'd question whether something should be done because it was a good idea. One thing we always ended up talking to with some of the devs who were on APOX was, hey, we did this, or we talked about this during the older game, but it didn't work out. And that would invariably end up being a conversation ender sometimes, which is never a good thing. And admittedly, being realistic is very important, but there's a fine line between being realistic and just not entertaining a conversation. So that was definitely an issue we faced during the development of Tryst. But on the positive side, that team was tight. We became friends. We supported each other, especially in the end days when we did have those salary issues I mentioned earlier. The senior staff really took care of the younger group. They helped out with the rent when we needed to. They'd call us over just to have dinner when they knew that it would be harder for us to kind of get through dinner sometimes. So the whole team mostly stays in touch now, even if it's not every day. To some extent, it's check in with each other every now and then. So I'd take that as a massive positive. But because we weren't sure about our tech, we decided to shift to another game engine. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But before I do, I'm just going to talk about the dev time that we had. Now, this was just a reality, given that we only had so much time to keep our doors open. We only had so much time to build a game. And when we would launch was pretty much almost a hard date that shifted by maybe 3-ish months. So that did mean we had to crunch. It meant we had fewer iterations of the game. A lot of decisions taken the first time over were decisions we had to stick with. And we didn't have the time to polish or optimize. I mean, in terms of that, one of the reviews did point out that we melted pretty decent graphic cards, even though we were a pretty low-spec game. So it was pretty bad in some ways. And crunch, I'd say, it wasn't a consistent death march. But everybody had their time where a few weeks they had to kind of stay late, get something done. And there's no way to quantify this one. Just 100 everyday decisions, little things that will add up over time that you can't pinpoint and say, hey, this is the moment that something went really wrong, or really right for that matter. But let's come back to the game engine. So at the time, APOX was built with Ogre. Right? And eventually we did choose to go with Unigine, but Ogre was where the core game was built. The two founders who had built this studio, one of them had built a prototype in Ogre and had called it Trash, and it was pretty cool, and the founders were like, yeah, let's make a studio, let's make this a real thing. And that's what APOX was built into. Because the founder who had built Trash was a programmer, and a pretty good one at that, we had a really modular code base. It was quite flexible, could do quite a bit, and it was C++ based. Downside with Ogre was we didn't have a level editor, and we did have, Ogre itself just has a weaker rendering engine. Now, at the time, you have to remember this is 2011, Unity was kind of a bigger deal than Unreal. Unreal was kind of like what the big dogs used, but Unity was C#, and we had a C++ code base and very limited time. So we were like, yeah, we can't spend all our time changing our code base. And while their support for C# was great, not so much for plus plus at the time. Unreal was paid, so definitely not an option. There weren't grants or any of the good stuff we have now. But Unigen was affordable, if kind of a very low-key engine. It was C++ compatible, and it had a better rendering engine than Ogre for sure. And I'm a little bit unsure about this, but I'm pretty sure we were their first third-party game. So that was an interesting little thing. Let's talk about the modular code base. And at this point, I'm going to move away from the high-level stuff and start drilling down into the actual game. The modular code base was a godsend, really. It meant that things were easier to implement. We already had a lot of stuff existing from Apox. They had, as I had said before, a ton of features that they had implemented. I mean, everything from like an aqueduct-style pipelines that you could construct down to like an ammo system. It was pretty intensive. But the main takeaways here were that we had a little bit more freedom with the gameplay we wanted to implement. The team was familiar. Like I said, there wasn't massive attrition from one game to the other, which also tells you how close-knit the team was. And that meant that the design team could be a lot more ambitious with what we wanted to do. To an extent, we still had limited time, and we could only do certain ambitious things, but we chose an area, and we said, we'll be ambitious here, we'll kind of keep things normal or stale here. So the decisions we took. Well, the high-level decision from the get-go from our founders were, we need asynchronous races. That'll help us be a little bit more in line with what was in market at the time. And the rest of us came up with the concept of, let's make where we really innovate the ability system. Let's add mutually exclusive objectives to the campaign. And one other thing we did, and this is really a massive positive from Apox, is the code base was so strong that we could actually add interesting little weapon mechanics to every unit. So not every unit just had a straight-up shot. Some of them had arced lob attacks. Others had beams that would ramp up with power over time, shotgun hits, damage that would either taper off or get stronger the further they went. We had quite a bit, and that was pretty nice. Just to build on this topic, other Apox mechanics that we had available to us were an ammo system. Apox was a bit unwieldy. It had like, every unit had individualized ammo. So we kind of streamlined that down. There was still a little bit of ammo, but it wasn't that big of a deal. We had control points. We had a cover system where if you were behind it, anything that was physical would be doing half damage. And we had a veterancy system. So if your units killed more enemies, they would level up. So you might want to keep your guys alive. And if you pay attention to this video, if it plays again, will it play again? Maybe not. What you would have noticed is that he's losing health while he's capturing that control point. We had environmental effects. So that was a little lava basin. So even though you would want that control point, you would lose a little health. So it was an interesting little addition to the maps. We had vegetation that would occasionally attack back and little things like that, just to make the map feel a bit more lively. The asynchronous races. This was a pretty cool idea, but it also meant that we had to double the amount of art we would do. We had hired a concept artist, and damn, that guy was good, but it meant he had a lot more work trying to figure out how everybody should look, how to make them look unique and recognizable. It also meant from the user point of view, people expected 2 campaigns. Like if you say, hey, here's an RTS and it's got this race and that race, people are going to want those 2 campaigns. And there was definitely no way we were doing that. But we kind of had to accept that loss. With unique races comes the challenge of teaching people what the unique stuff is, and that's never easy either. And balancing. I was a kid right out of college at the time, so what did I know about balancing except high-level, ideals of this is what I've read on an article somewhere. But we managed. So we built 2 races. We had a human race that we basically said, okay, we don't do anything super fancy with these guys. They're the straight-up RTS classic. You have a headquarters, you build buildings. As you do, you upgrade the headquarters. That unlocks more buildings and more units and so on and so forth. But instead of putting our upgrades in the buildings, we tied it into a whole different system. And the research types that we had between the 2 races was also a little bit different. And I'll just show you an example. So this was our secondary race. They were called the Zali. They were kind of like a biomechanical robot race, and instead of building a lot of buildings, they had a much cleaner sort of base. You started with this headquarters, and if you notice, there are 3 orbs circling the top. Those orbs basically were devotion points, because nomenclature was not really our thing, if you can go by our title name. They basically allowed you to build temples, and there were 3 temples you could spec into. A temple of strife, preservation, and silence, and they were basically an aggressive, a defensive, and a more tricksy option, respectively. The cool thing with this was that whenever you built one of these temples, it would take a devotion point. And if you wanted to upgrade one, it would take a devotion point as well. So you could only have a certain combination of them. You could either choose to get level 1 across the board for all 3. You could go with the 2-1 build, or just commit to one type and say, I will only build this temple and only get the units that I would get from it. But I would also get their special upgrades. So if you look here, this is what our upgrade panel looked like. And this is a unit called the Pudge. All the units are mentioned on the sides, and the temples are mentioned above. And if you took this particular temple at level 1, you would get the double shot ability. And if you upgraded it, then you would get the other. If you took Strife, you would get another ability that allowed you to leave an area of effect after that thing finished attacking. And the cool thing about this unit was that not only did it do an artillery strike, but it also allowed you to load up units and fire them across the map as well, within a certain range. And with the Preservation Temple, you could fire more people across the map, allowing you to use this unit in a very different way. Now, you'll notice that between these 3 temples, the number of options we have also differ, and that was intentional. The 4 units on this side are your base units. The 3 below there are kind of tied to each temple. And these are high-level units and turrets specifically, and even 3 of the lower turrets are tied to a temple. And the idea was that certain units do have certain affinities, but we tried to make it a little bit, or not as extreme, so that you could still have a little bit of choice and make it matter. And if you needed to pivot, you had the options. And that's probably a good segue into this whole talk about abilities. We called the system the ARM because we realized maybe for marketing we needed a cool buzzword instead of just saying unique upgrade system. Unfortunately, we were not good at naming things, so we called it the Augmentation Research Mechanism. So that was a really great idea. One of the choices we had, though, was that we could put in abilities for all these units, and the question we kind of asked ourselves was, how many actives do we want versus passives? If you have too many passives, you're only focused on moving the units around. You don't really care about positioning as much. You care about the positioning of the group, but not individuals. You don't care about what compositions of units per se. But we wanted active abilities so that you kind of interacted with individual units a bit more. But that also meant that there's a certain mental load that players will pick up when they have a lot that they have to do. And the natural kind of progression from saying, hey, we'll put in active abilities, but we'll limit how many they can have to a maximum of 3, meant not only did we have to design it with every combination in mind and ensure that it never went past 3, but it also meant just organically the game became more about fewer units, and we kind of leaned into that, where it was a very skirmish-based game about kind of moving 2 or 3 groups of 2 or 3 units around and kind of using their abilities in tandem. And that also meant the multiplayer sessions were pretty short. And this is at a time when most big RTS matches went to like roughly 60 minutes. We were hitting an average of 20. So it was a huge change from what the norm was. Now, some of the decisions we took to like build out the system was we wanted to keep stat boosts to a minimum, and this is more of a personal design decision for me. I like stat boosts in certain contexts, but not all the time. To just like kind of condense a lot of my thoughts on this, stat boosts are great when you have individual units where you can say, hey, this particular unit with this name, like let's just say, where is he? Shogun has a +1 to damage, right? I care about that, yeah. But if I say all game designers have +1 to damage, that you don't care about that. You care about it as a high-level player when you're having like 30 versus 30 armies going at it, because that +1 makes a difference. But if we're already going with fewer units, the +1 really doesn't matter. So we chose to go with more noticeable changes. And that's also a bit more interactive. And for a lower skill level, it's a lot more readable when you can see a very obvious thing happen. It tells you that, okay, this guy can do this now, and he didn't do that before. And how am I going to react to it? Another decision we took to that end, and this is probably where MOBAs were really hitting their stride, and a lot of us did play, you know, Dota and League back in 2011, was to use a QWE ability activation system. And once we get to one of the other screenshots of the game, you'll see it on the UI. We had a huge discussion about using the same format of QWE, RASD, and then that whole left-hand side of the keyboard as a direct mapping to your 3x3 command panel. I lost that debate because we felt it might be too risky and too alien to RTS players. It's kind of the norm now, which is kind of good, but we didn't go with it at the time. We stuck with the tried and true hotkey is related to the name of the action, so if it was build, it would be a B to press it. So just so that you can see it, this is what the upgrade panel looked like for the machine race, the Zali. And this is what it looked like for the humans. And the humans upgrade panel was a bit different because if you look at the left, under the character, there are 3 slots. So at every headquarters level, and standard 3-level headquarters, you could get 1 upgrade, and you could choose an upgrade from one of the 3 or one of the 2 you had available to you. And some of them were stat boosts, because at the end of the day, we still had a few areas where we just had to do that. But for the most part, we tried to add some really interesting passives or really interesting actives that really changed how a unit behaved. And the whole thing that we were going for was a bit of a constant counterplay, where if your opponent did something and you noticed that ability, you'd be like, okay, I have an ability that I can spec into that counters that. And then he would do something similar, and it would kind of progress until eventually somebody lost. Another reality of our situation was we had no UI or UX experience. And as a designer, this is probably a personal failing, because I still suck at UI. We kind of ended up doing a lot of what we saw as being kind of industry standard. We kind of just hit what was known. And that kind of meant there was a lot of pattern match recognition with when people saw screenshots of our game. I'm sure you've seen screenshots of our game and you're like, oh, that's StarCraft. And you know, that's fair. The UI is very StarCraft. Because we didn't iterate and because we were not really UI focused, it was a very programmer heavy studio, Our UI was very unpolished to look at as well. And yeah, so everyone's first reaction is this. But if you remember me talking about it, and if you watch our gameplay, we had stuff like this happening. And just as a quick aside, those little 2 squares above the thing meant that you could capture it, and then it would say you captured it, but the other slot was for an ally. So an ally could come in and capture it too, so it wasn't like excluding your buddy. So you could both capture a point and share the resources, and if both of you had it, if I remember correctly, it would actually boost how much you gained. So you wanted to play together. But what I'm trying to say here is this was more of the case, because that was our inspiration. A lot of the Relic games, we really loved that. And while visually we did have more of a StarCraft appearance, mechanically we were very Relic, Dawn of War-ish. But of course, that first sort of viewpoint that people have is very key. So StarCraft kind of sticks in your mind when you've seen it, and then we saw a lot of people just comparing it to that a lot, which also told us that those people who did that didn't fully play the game. But that's besides the point. Let's talk about the campaign. We chose to go with mutually exclusive objectives. And I did mention we didn't really have a strong mission scripting tool or anything like that. There was something there, but it wasn't as robust as our code base that allows us to build all these abilities. And since I was constantly busy building that out with the programmers, we desperately needed someone to handle this. So we actually did, about 4-ish months in, hire a technical designer, fantastic dude, and he came in and built the campaign out in 4 months. Just before launch, I think 2 weeks before launch, we finished up the last mission, made it as foolproof as we could, took out all the hard blockers. But that also meant he had to script these 6 missions in 4 months, and that was a bit difficult, and he did crunch quite a bit. But that's the best we could have done with the time we had, and that also meant when we launched, we only had 6 missions, and that's a big sticking point, and we heard about that as well. So obviously, that's a consequence and a decision. And we hoped that the game would do well enough that we would be able to launch a DLC that kind of shored that up and kind of added that secondary campaign that people would really enjoy. This is the big one. This is kind of a reality for us still a bit to this day. Not as much as it was back in 2011. We're here. We're kind of secluded from the rest of the game industry. We joined the game industry later than everyone as well. So major game events were expensive. I mean, going to them itself is expensive, but then now you also have to factor in the cost of a ticket. So there was no way that was happening. Investment was not a thing back in the day. If people were even looking at gaming, it was probably as art outsourcing or maybe the starting of the mobile boom, but that was the best of it. I said before, the founders put their own money into this, so that's how we got to do this, is because they took the chance, because they had essentially the passion and the drive to try and make their dreams a reality. And sadly, we were shit at talking about ourselves, and that's this last point. Even in the country, no one knew we existed. We basically launched the first Steam game out of the country. We built 2 RTSs, which are fairly major PC games at the time, and we were still unknown. And I know this because way back when IGDC was still NASCOM GDC or something like that, I remember coming out to the event. I remember joining the Facebook forum and just talking to people. And they asked what I did. I was like, yeah, I'm a designer at Blue Giant. And they were like, who's that? So I told them. And they're like, where's that? And I told them. They're like, what do you do? And I told them. And they're like, holy shit, who's making an RTS? So that really cemented just how unknown we were. And if we couldn't talk about ourselves within the country, within our community, we sure as hell weren't doing it outside. So me and the other designer tried to rectify that as much as we could with what little time we had. We made a massive list of as many journalists as we could find. We trawled the internet, found every video game journalist site as we could. We scouted out the reviewers ourselves, tried to find people with a leaning towards strategy, tactics, even MOBAs, because it's slightly adjacent, and emailed them. We wrote personalized emails to about 30, 35 people. I think we got a reply to 2 at best. And yeah, that was just to kind of get the word out. And this is before we even had press kit, so we were just kind of making shit up as we went. The other thing we did, and this was just more as a trial run, is BITS Pilani, which is a college university in the outskirts of Secunderabad, I believe. They were having a tech fest, so we decided to go there and just kind of showcase the game to see what the average college kid would think of the game. And the reception was all right. I mean, we realized also that a lot of people play Dota and CSGO and not much else. So we had a few people who were familiar with RTSs, but not too many. And finally, we opted in for a paid review from a reviewer who was really into the genre, just to give us an idea of what to expect when we launched. And I think that was also hesitancy from the way Apox was launched, because that was a cold launch, and they didn't expect the type of reaction that they got. So I think this was also to kind of console themselves, or at least fortify their minds to what might be coming down the line. The paid review was actually quite interesting. This guy basically said that he really liked the upgrade system, and he was really intrigued by how the machine race worked, which I may not have explained yet. But the idea with the machine race was you had a basic worker, and he could morph into the buildings and into higher level units. And you would also build tertiary or secondary units, and the base guy and the secondary guy could morph together to build your end game units. And that was kind of the whole thing with them, is that you're always just kind of taking base things and building them into bigger stuff. But he did warn us, and this was the really prophetic part, that pretty much everybody who would be reviewing this would talk about the lack of campaign content, that they'd talk about the multiplayer lobby, because we were an unknown studio technically, or a small studio out here. Not too many people would know about us, so not too many people would buy in and try multiplayer, and because of that, the multiplayer lobby would look empty, and so when people came in, it would be harder for them to look at the game, and reviewers especially would come in and be like, aha, dead game. So we got a lot of that actually, that it's just a dead game on launch. And we also got like warnings of that we'd be panned for the lack of polish. And all 3 of those points, if you ever go searching for reviews of the game, that's universal. So finally, we had to rush to launch. That was a reality, a decision, a consequence, everything all rolled into one. What's interesting about this is we launched at a really interesting point in time, because we kept telling like the management team that we should hold back. The management team is like, there's no way we can, keep going anymore, so it has to be now or never. So we kind of were forced into our launch window. And the launch window was interesting because a few other smaller titles released in that same week. One of them was FTL, Torchlight 2, and Borderlands 2. So what that meant is that we probably got a few hours worth of press time where we got an article or 2, and then everybody was just talking about all the other games. And there was no way we were going to stand out in that crowd. Lovely games, by the way. Fans of all 3. But that also meant we didn't sell too well. And with Apox not having done well, with Tryst not having done well, we tried to support the game. We launched a DLC with like an endless horde mode, where you controlled heroes and maybe a few units, just as a co-op thing. And we then tried to pivot to doing a few service-based games. But over time, I think Tryst really hurt the team, and people started leaving, I think myself included. Within 6 months of that launch, most of the studio had kind of abandoned ship. So it's a bit of a downer ending, but that's the story of Blue Giant and Tryst. But there are a few silver linings. I know it's not a big deal, but I'm kind of proud of the fact that with the year and maybe a month, we managed to go from 48 to 50 Metacritic. It's not just that, but our user score jumped from 3.9 to 6.2, which is a little bit more significant. So if you are a metrics person, you see the percentage rise, you're like, okay, that's at least worth noting. So I was happy about that. We also got more reviews that were in the middle range than the negative range with the second game. The other thing is that in the month and a half that we were active and like actively playing the game with our community and supporting it, we had a few really like hardcore players. And this is a screenshot from something somebody posted on the Steam community where they beat me in a one-on-one after like 3 weeks of trying. And they were just super proud of the fact that they finally beat one of the devs. And yeah, so we had about 5-ish super fans who were really into the game, and they would stay in the lobby, and as soon as any new person logged in, they would just be like, hey, let me teach you how to play the game. We need to build this community. So that was nice. And finally, I know I've tried to be as dispassionate about what happened as possible, but at the end of the day, this was a team made by a group of game devs back in the day, so it is a bit of a human story. These are the best pictures I could find because we never took pictures of ourselves. This is our Bits Pilani trip, so this is whoever turned up for that. And this is at IGDC, our launch, and just the studio in general. And I was like, I guess a final epitaph for the studio. Like, we did have founders who did like something super ambitious, put their money into building a studio, and they gave it the good old college try. And I'm proud of that, and I'm really glad I got to be a part of it, even if it was towards the tail end of it. Oh, and if anyone's curious about why we called it Tryst, I'll just play a little bit of audio here, and hopefully it plays for you. Some of you are familiar.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially.
So yeah, we were young, we were idealistic, and we were like, let's call it after our independence speech. And Tryst with Destiny was too long, so we shortened it to Tryst. That was a great idea. But yeah, if I didn't win that battle, we probably would have been called Iron Sky or something like that. So you can choose which you like better. And that's it. That's my talk. If you'd be kind enough to take the QR code, give feedback, it helps the organizers kind of decide what to do next year. And if you want to reach me, I'm on LinkedIn with my name, Tejas Oza. Rogue Pylon is my general Twitter handle. And if you like anything related to tabletop games, check out Tactics and Shy, where I do tabletop games. That's about it.